The sorting hat trembled as reality fractured around it. For 1,000 years it had guided young wizards to their destined houses at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared it for this moment when the very fabric of existence would tear apart like parchment in a hurricane. Have you ever wondered what would happen if the most beloved characters in fantasy literature suddenly found themselves thrust into the most brutal, unforgiving universe ever conceived? Where magic meets mechanized warfare, where hope itself becomes a heretical concept, and where the innocent wonder of childhood dies screaming in the endless night of eternal war. Well, buckle up, because today we're about to discover what happens when Harry Potter, Hermione Granger, and Ron Weasley step through a dimensional rift and land face first into the grim darkness of Warhammer 40,000. And trust me, the boy who lived is about to learn that surviving Voldemort was just kindergarten compared to what the 41st millennium has in store. But before we dive headfirst into this cosmic collision of universes, let me tell you exactly what you're getting into. Over the next several parts, I'm going to walk you through a complete transformation scenario where our favorite trio doesn't just visit the Warhammer 40,000 universe, they become part of it. We'll explore how their magic would be perceived by the Imperium of Man, what the Inquisition would make of their abilities, and whether their friendship could possibly survive in a galaxy where trust itself is a luxury few can afford. I've spent months researching both universes, analyzing the lore, the power systems, the theological implications, and the psychological frameworks that would govern such an encounter. This isn't just a simple crossover story. This is a deep dive into what happens when two fundamentally different approaches to heroism collide in the most spectacular way possible. The dimensional breach opened above the Great Hall during what should have been a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning feast. Students were buttering their toast, complaining about upcoming exams, and generally existing in that comfortable bubble of adolescent concerns that would soon seem impossibly naive. The first sign something was wrong came when every magical portrait in the castle began screaming simultaneously. Professor McGonagall stood from the head table, her stern expression shifting to one of genuine alarm as the very air began to shimmer with unnatural energy. The candles floating above their heads flickered and died, plunging the hall into an eerie twilight, broken only by the sickly green light seeping through the growing tear in reality. Harry felt his scar burning with an intensity that made his encounter with Quirrell seem like a mild headache. But this wasn't the familiar, cold pain of Voldemort's presence. This was something else entirely, something vast and alien and utterly hostile to everything he understood about magic, about life, about hope itself. Hermione grabbed her wand, already muttering diagnostic spells under her breath, trying to understand what they were witnessing. Her brilliant mind, so accustomed to finding logical explanations for even the most bizarre magical phenomena, simply couldn't process the wrongness of what was happening. The mathematics of magic itself seemed to be breaking down. Ron, ever practical despite his frequent complaints, was already moving toward the younger students, herding them away from the expanding anomaly. His face had gone pale, but his hands remained steady. Years of living in the shadow of his more accomplished brothers had taught him when to act first and ask questions later. The tear in reality widened, revealing glimpses of something that shouldn't exist. Through the breach, they caught flashes of a universe painted in shades of rust and blood. Gothic architecture stretched toward perpetually overcast skies. The distant sound of artillery fire echoed through dimensions, accompanied by the mechanical drone of machinery beyond anything the wizarding world had ever conceived. Then came the smell, the stench of promethium fuel, recycled air, and something else, something that made their magic recoil in instinctive horror. It was the smell of a universe where hope had been systematically murdered and replaced with grim necessity. Professor Dumbledore burst through the doors of the Great Hall, his usual calm demeanor cracked by urgency. His blue eyes, normally twinkling with hidden knowledge and gentle humor, now blazed with power as he raised the Elder Wand. But even his considerable magical abilities seemed to falter in the face of this dimensional catastrophe. The headmaster's voice carried across the chaos with magically enhanced authority. All students are to evacuate immediately. Prefects, guide your houses to the designated safe areas. Faculty, with me. But it was too late for evacuation. The breach had stabilized, and something was coming through. Not the familiar forms of Death Eaters or dark creatures they were prepared to face, but figures in armor that seemed to absorb light itself. Their movements spoke of military discipline refined over centuries of constant warfare. These weren't wizards. They weren't even entirely human anymore. The nearest figure removed its helmet, revealing a face that had been sculpted by conflict into something barely recognizable as having once been mortal. Scars crisscrossed features that had been enhanced with cybernetic implants. One eye had been replaced with a red optical augmentation that scanned the Great Hall with mechanical precision. When it spoke, its voice carried the weight of authority, backed by absolute conviction. By the Emperor's grace, we have found them. The unsanctioned psykers whose dimensional breach threatens the stability of local space-time. Harry stepped forward, his Gryffindor courage overriding his common sense. We didn't create any breach. We don't even know what's happening. The figure's remaining organic eye fixed on Harry with an intensity that made him feel like a specimen under a microscope. You bear the mark of warp contamination, young psyker. Your very existence is an affront to the Emperor's design for humanity. Hermione's analytical mind finally found its footing. Psyker? You mean someone with psychic abilities? But that's just magic. We're wizards. A sound emerged from the armored figure that might have been laughter, but it carried no warmth, no humor, only grim recognition. Magic, you call it. Witchcraft. The ignorant names given to warp manipulation by those too primitive to understand the true horror of what they wield. More figures emerged from the breach, their equipment unlike anything in the wizarding world's experience. Where magic had always felt organic, natural despite its impossibility, these newcomers carried devices that hummed with barely contained violence. Their very presence seemed to make the air itself heavier, more oppressive. The lead figure continued his explanation with the tone of someone delivering a medical diagnosis. You exist in a reality that has been shielded from the truth of the Imperium. Your souls touch the warp with every spell you cast, yet you remain ignorant of the entities that hunger for such contact. In our universe, unsanctioned psykers are eliminated for the protection of all humanity. Ron found his voice, though it cracked slightly. Eliminated? You mean killed, just for being able to do magic? The figure nodded with mechanical precision. The alternative is worse, far worse. A single uncontrolled psyker can open a breach that consumes entire worlds. Billions die when the warp spills into reality unchecked. Dumbledore stepped forward, his presence commanding despite the overwhelming strangeness of the situation. I am Albus Dumbledore, headmaster of this institution. These are children under my protection. Whatever your concerns about our magical abilities, surely we can discuss this rationally. The armored figure studied Dumbledore with what might have been professional interest. Your psychic potential exceeds even our preliminary estimates. In our reality, you would have been identified as an alpha-class threat and dealt with accordingly. The fact that you have survived to such an advanced age suggests either exceptional control or exceptional isolation. As the conversation continued, more details of their visitor's universe began to emerge. A galaxy-spanning empire where humanity fought an endless war against alien species, demonic entities, and the corrupting influence of chaos itself. Where magic, or psychic power as they called it, was viewed as both a necessary tool and an existential threat. The technological marvels they carried made even the most advanced magical artifacts seem primitive by comparison. Yet for all their advancement, there was something hollow about these warriors. They spoke of duty and necessity with the fervor of religious conviction, but their eyes held the weight of too many compromises, too many necessary evils. Harry found himself studying their leader's face, trying to understand how someone could become so thoroughly armored against hope itself. This wasn't the calculated malice of Voldemort or the desperate hunger of the Death Eaters. This was something far more disturbing, the complete absence of any belief that things could ever be better. The implications began to sink in as more soldiers emerged from the breach. They weren't here as conquerors or explorers. They were here as exterminators, carrying out what they genuinely believed to be a mercy killing. In their universe, The existence of untrained psykers was an intolerable risk to everyone around them. But there was something else, something the lead figure hadn't mentioned yet. As Hermione watched their movements, studied their equipment, analyzed their speech patterns, she began to realize that these weren't just soldiers. They were refugees. Something had driven them through the dimensional breach, something that had forced them to abandon their own reality. The question that would determine everyone's fate hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Could two fundamentally different approaches to power, to sacrifice, to hope itself, coexist? Or would this encounter destroy both universes in the process? The Sorting Hat, still trembling on its stool, finally spoke in a voice that carried centuries of wisdom and newly acquired terror. In all my years, I have sorted students based on their courage, their cunning, their loyalty, and their wisdom. But I have never encountered minds shaped by a reality where such virtues become weapons turned against hope itself. The dimensional breach pulsed with increasing instability, and through it came the sound of something vast and hungry stirring in the space between worlds. The sound that emerged from the breach wasn't mechanical like the warrior's equipment or organic like the familiar noises of the magical world. It was something else entirely, a harmony of voices that shouldn't exist, singing words in a language that predated human speech. The temperature in the Great Hall dropped 20 degrees in an instant, and every magical creature within the castle began to howl in unison. The lead warrior's cybernetic eye blazed brighter as targeting data scrolled across his vision. "Warp entities," he stated with the same tone one might use to announce bad weather. "The breach has attracted attention from the Imperium. We have perhaps minutes before manifestation occurs." Hermione's brilliant mind seized on this new information like a lifeline. "Imperium? You mean there's another dimension parallel to ours? And these entities, they're drawn to magical activity?" The warrior spared her a glance that might have contained approval if such emotions hadn't been systematically purged from his conditioning. "Your analytical capabilities are impressive for an untrained psyker. Yes, what you call magic draws power from the warp, the realm of pure emotion and thought given form. Every spell you cast sends ripples through that dimension, attracting the attention of beings that exist only to corrupt and consume." Ron stepped closer to his friends, his grip tightening on his wand. "So every time we've done magic, we've been calling to monsters?" "Not calling," corrected another warrior, this one bearing the insignia of a tech priest, half of his face replaced with mechanical augmentations. "Broadcasting. Your souls shine like beacons in the warp. In our reality, such untrained emission would have drawn daemon princes within hours." The singing grew louder, and the breach began to widen again. Through the dimensional tear, shapes moved that hurt to look at directly. They defied geometric logic, existing in too many dimensions simultaneously. Students who hadn't yet evacuated began to weep blood from their eyes, simply from glimpsing these impossible forms. Professor McGonagall stepped forward, her transformation into her animagus form rippling across her body before she forced it back under control. "Headmaster, the younger students are still in the castle. Whatever these creatures are, we cannot allow them to manifest here." Dumbledore nodded grimly, his wand beginning to emit a steady golden light. "Indeed, Minerva. It appears we must choose between the certainty of conflict with our visitors and the unknown horror of what approaches through their dimensional breach." The lead warrior made a sound that might have been bitter laughter. "There is no choice, Elder Psyker. The entities of chaos care nothing for your intentions or your innocence. They will consume this reality as they have consumed countless others. The only question is whether you will die fighting them or die feeding them." Harry felt something stir within his scar, but this time, it wasn't the familiar burning of Voldemort's presence. This was different, older, hungrier. Something beyond the breach had noticed him specifically, and the attention felt like ice water in his veins. The warrior's optical augmentation focused on Harry with sudden intensity. "You," he said, his voice carrying a note of something approaching wonder. "Your psychic signature is unlike anything in our databases. There's a resonance, a harmonic, that suggests previous exposure to warp entities of significant power." Before Harry could respond, the air in the Great Hall began to thicken like syrup, Reality itself seemed to be struggling to maintain coherence as whatever lurked beyond the breach pressed closer to manifestation. The ancient stones of Hogwarts groaned under pressure that existed in dimensions humans weren't meant to perceive. Then Hermione did something that would have impressed even the tech priests of Mars. She began to calculate, not with quill and parchment, but with pure mathematics projected through her magic. Equations of stunning complexity appeared in the air around her, glowing with soft blue light as she worked to understand the fundamental forces at play. "The breach is unstable," she announced, her voice cutting through the rising chaos. "It's not just a doorway between our realities. It's a wound in space-time itself, and it's growing. At the current rate of expansion, it will encompass the entire castle within the hour." The tech priest turned his mechanical gaze upon her with something approaching reverence. "Remarkable. She performs calculations that would require a cogitator array to process. Her understanding of dimensional mechanics exceeds that of some Magos biologies." But Hermione wasn't finished. Her equations grew more complex, incorporating variables that shouldn't exist in any sane universe. "There's something else. The entities trying to come through aren't just attracted to our magic. They're being driven here by something even worse in your reality. They're fleeing." This revelation sent a ripple of unease through the warriors that their conditioning couldn't entirely suppress. The concept of warp entities fleeing from anything was so fundamentally wrong that it challenged their basic understanding of the universe. The lead warrior activated communication protocols that filled the air with binary code and static. "Command, this is Inquisitor Vex of the Ordo Malleus. We have encountered a stable reality bubble with indigenous psyker population. Recommend immediate quarantine protocols and..." His transmission cut off abruptly. In the sudden silence, a new voice emerged from the breach. Not the inhuman singing of warp entities, but something far more terrifying. It was a human voice, speaking with the authority of absolute power and the weariness of infinite responsibility. "My children," the voice said, and every soul in the Great Hall felt the weight of 10,000 years of sacrifice behind those words. "You have found them at last." The warriors dropped to one knee in perfect synchronization, their weapons held across their chests in a gesture of absolute fealty. When they spoke in unison, their voices carried the fervor of true believers. "By your will, God Emperor of mankind." Dumbledore's eyes widened with recognition of power that transcended anything he had ever encountered. The voice that emerged from the breach carried the psychic weight of a being who had guided humanity through its darkest hour for millennia. This wasn't just another wizard or magical creature. This was something that had transcended mortality itself. The Emperor's presence filled the Great Hall like golden sunlight, but it was a harsh light that revealed uncomfortable truths. When his attention fell upon the students of Hogwarts, they felt themselves being judged by standards they couldn't comprehend. "So young," the Emperor's voice carried notes of genuine sorrow, "so innocent of the true nature of the power they wield. In my reality, they would have been taken for training before their 10th year. Those who survived the process would have become valuable assets to humanity's survival." Harry found his voice, though speaking felt like trying to shout into a hurricane. "And those who didn't survive?" The pause stretched for an eternity before the Emperor responded. "Would have died with honor, their sacrifice preventing the damnation of billions. Such is the price of wielding power in a universe that offers no sanctuary from the consequences of our choices." Ron's face had gone pale, but his voice held steady. "That's mental. You're talking about murdering children because they might become dangerous." The golden presence didn't diminish, but something like approval colored the Emperor's response. "Your loyalty to your friends is admirable, young one. In my reality, such bonds are precious beyond measure, but loyalty without wisdom leads to damnation. I have watched civilizations burn because they could not make the hard choices when mercy became cruelty." The breach pulsed again, and this time something did come through. Not the chaotic entities they had feared, but a single figure in armor that made the warrior's equipment look primitive. The newcomer moved with fluid grace that spoke of perfect fusion between human will and technological enhancement. When the figure removed their helmet, it revealed features that had been beautiful once, before duty and sacrifice had carved them into something harder than adamantium. The face was feminine, but marked by scars that told stories of battles fought in defense of ideals that had long since become necessities. "I am Canoness Superior Seraphina of the Order of the Sacred Rose," she announced, her voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction. "I come bearing the Emperor's mercy and his judgment." Her gaze swept across the assembled students and faculty with the practiced eye of someone who had spent centuries distinguishing between those who could be saved and those who were already lost. When her eyes met Harry's, she paused, her expression shifting to one of puzzled recognition. "You," she said, stepping closer. "You bear a mark I have seen before, not chaos, corruption, but something else. Something that speaks of sacrifice willingly made and power accepted for the protection of others." Harry touched his scar unconsciously. "Voldemort marked me when I was a baby. I've carried part of his soul ever since." The Canoness's eyes widened, and for the first time since entering their reality, she showed genuine surprise. "You carry a fragment of a daemon's essence and yet remain uncorrupted? Impossible. Even the strongest souls fall to such influence given time." Hermione's analytical mind seized on this new information. "But Harry isn't corrupted. He's fought against Voldemort's influence for years. He's used that connection to protect others, to understand his enemy." The Canoness studied Harry with the intensity of a scholar examining a previously unknown species. "In my reality, what you describe would be considered either a miracle of the Emperor's protection or evidence of corruption so subtle that it had not yet manifested. The fact that you have resisted for so long suggests either exceptional strength of character or—" She paused, her hand moving to the holy symbols adorning her armor, "or divine intervention of a kind we have not witnessed in millennia." The Emperor's presence stirred, and when he spoke again, his voice carried notes of something that might have been hope. "Perhaps that is why the warp storms have driven my servants to this reality. Not to destroy, but to learn, to discover if there truly exists a place where power can be wielded without corruption, where sacrifice need not always end in damnation." The implications of this statement sent ripples of shock through the assembled warriors. The concept that their god emperor might have something to learn from untrained children challenged the very foundation of their reality. But before anyone could respond, the dimensional breach began to collapse. Not gradually, as dimensional rifts typically did, but with sudden violence that spoke of external intervention. Through the narrowing aperture, they caught glimpses of something vast and terrible bearing down on the point of connection. The Canoness's voice cut through the chaos with military precision. "Tyrannid Hive Fleet, they've found the breach point. We have seconds before they begin attempting forced entry." The warriors moved with practiced efficiency, their equipment humming to life as they prepared for a battle that would determine the fate of two realities. And in that moment, as chaos erupted around them, Harry Potter made a decision that would change everything. Harry stepped forward, his wand raised not in defense but in offering. The decision crystallized in his mind with the same clarity he had felt when walking into the Forbidden Forest to face Voldemort's killing curse. But this time, he wasn't walking toward death. He was walking toward something far more dangerous: hope. "I'll go with you," he said, his voice cutting through the mechanical whine of charging weapons and the distant roar of whatever horror approached through the collapsing breach. "If there's a chance that our magic, our way of doing things, might help your people, then I'll learn your methods." Ron grabbed his arm immediately. "Harry, you can't be serious. These people are talking about training that kills children, about a universe where hope is literally heresy." Hermione's brilliant mind was already racing ahead, seeing patterns and possibilities that others missed. "No, Ron, don't you see? This isn't about Harry sacrificing himself. This is about proving that there's another way, that power doesn't have to corrupt." The Canoness studied the trio with renewed interest. Her centuries of experience had taught her to recognize true conviction, and what she saw in these young faces was something her reality had almost forgotten existed: the genuine belief that things could be better. "You understand nothing of what you propose," she said, but her tone carried warning rather than dismissal. "In our reality, hope without strength is delusion. Faith without sacrifice is meaningless. You speak of proving another way exists, but you have never faced the true enemies of mankind." The dimensional breach continued its violent collapse, reality folding in on itself like origami made of space-time. Through the narrowing aperture, massive shapes moved with purpose that spoke of intelligence, vast and alien. The Tyrannid hive fleet had indeed found them, drawn by the psychic resonance of the breach itself. Inquisitor Vex's augmented voice cut through the rising tension. "Canoness, we have perhaps 30 seconds before complete dimensional severance. The hive mind's bio-ships are already launching boarding spores toward the breach point." Dumbledore approached the group, his ancient eyes reflecting wisdom that had been earned through decades of impossible choices. "Harry, my boy, you cannot make this decision lightly. What these people describe is not simply a different educational system, it is a fundamental restructuring of your very soul." The Emperor's presence stirred again, and when he spoke, his words carried the weight of prophecy. "The boy speaks truth he does not yet understand. There comes a time in every reality when it must choose between stagnation and evolution. My Imperium has chosen survival above all else, and in doing so, we may have lost something essential to humanity's future." These words sent shockwaves through the assembled warriors. The idea that their God Emperor might question the fundamental tenets of imperial doctrine was so revolutionary it bordered on blasphemy. But Harry wasn't finished. His green eyes blazed with the same fire that had driven him to walk into countless dangers for the sake of others. "Then let me be the bridge between our realities. I've carried a piece of pure evil in my soul for 17 years and never let it corrupt me. If that's possible, then maybe other impossible things are possible too." The Canoness removed something from her belt, a device that hummed with barely contained energy. It resembled no technology the wizarding world had ever seen, all flowing curves and surfaces that seemed to bend light around themselves. "This is a psychic resonance amplifier," she explained, her voice taking on the reverent tone reserved for sacred relics. "It was blessed by the Emperor himself during the Great Crusade. If you truly wish to understand our reality, this will allow you to experience what we face every day." Hermione stepped forward, her analytical mind already cataloging the device's properties. "What exactly does it do?" The tech priest answered, his mechanical voice carrying notes of something approaching awe. "It strips away the barriers that separate your soul from the warp. For a brief moment, you will see reality as we see it. The entities that hunger for your destruction, the constant pressure of forces that seek to corrupt every thought and deed." Ron's face had gone white. "That sounds like a fantastic way to drive someone completely mad." The Canoness nodded grimly. "Many who attempt the trial do indeed lose their sanity, but those who emerge intact possess understanding that cannot be gained through any other means. They see the necessity of our methods, the wisdom of our sacrifices." Harry reached for the device without hesitation, but Hermione caught his wrist. "Harry, think about this rationally. We don't know anything about their technology, or what it might do to someone from our reality. This could kill you." For a moment, the great hall fell silent, except for the distant rumble of collapsing dimensions. Harry looked at his best friends, seeing in their faces the same loyalty that had carried them through 7 years of increasingly dangerous adventures. But he also saw something else, the recognition that this moment was different from all the others. "Remember when we were first years?" Harry said quietly, "and you told me that there are more important things than friendship, like bravery, and right, and wrong. This is one of those times, Hermione." The Canoness held the device steady, but her expression had softened slightly. "Your friends may accompany you through the trial if they wish. It is unusual, but not unheard of, for bonds of loyalty to provide additional psychic resistance." Ron's grip tightened on his wand. "Well, when you put it like that, how can I say no? Besides, someone needs to be there to say, 'I told you so,' when this goes horribly wrong." Hermione's analytical nature warred with her protective instincts for several seconds before she finally nodded. "If we're doing this, we do it together. But I want to understand exactly what we're agreeing to first." The tech priest stepped forward, his mechanical limbs whirring as he accessed data files. "The trial will expose your consciousness to the raw emanations of the Imperium. You will experience, for approximately 12 minutes and 37 seconds, what it means to exist in a reality where every thought, every emotion, every moment of hope or despair feeds entities that exist only to consume and corrupt. Professor McGonagall moved closer, her stern features showing genuine concern. "Headmaster, surely we cannot allow our students to undergo such a dangerous procedure." But Dumbledore's expression was thoughtful rather than alarmed. "Minerva, I have spent my entire life believing that understanding between different peoples is possible, that wisdom can be shared across even the vastest cultural divides. If these young people are willing to take such a risk in service of that ideal, how can we stand in their way?" The dimensional breach gave one final, violent shudder before stabilizing at roughly half its original size. Through the aperture, they could see the massive forms of Tyranid bioships moving closer, their living hulls pulsing with bioluminescent patterns that spoke of intelligence beyond human. Inquisitor Vex's optical comprehension. Augmentations flared brighter as he processed tactical data. Contact in 17 minutes. The hive mind is probing the dimensional barriers, testing for weaknesses. Once they achieve breakthrough, both realities will be compromised. The canoness activated the psychic resonance amplifier, and the device began to emit a low harmonic that seemed to resonate in dimensions beyond the physical. "Join hands," she instructed. "The trial is more survivable when consciousness remains linked to others who share your moral foundation." Harry, Ron, and Hermione formed a triangle, their hands clasped tightly. As the device's influence washed over them, the familiar walls of the Great Hall began to fade, replaced by something that their minds struggled to process. They found themselves standing in a vast Gothic cathedral that stretched beyond the horizon in all directions. The architecture was simultaneously magnificent and oppressive, every surface carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. Above them, stained glass windows depicted scenes of battles fought across 10,000 years of constant warfare. But it was what lay beyond the cathedral walls that truly tested their sanity. The sky writhed with entities that defied geometric logic, creatures of pure malevolence that pressed constantly against barriers made of faith and will. Every surface, every shadow, every moment of silence teemed with whispers, promising power, knowledge, pleasure, or release from pain. Ron staggered, his face going pale as he experienced the constant pressure of forces seeking to corrupt every thought. "Bloody hell," he whispered. "This is what it's like all the time for them. No wonder they're so grim." Hermione's analytical mind reeled as she processed the sheer scale of the threats arrayed against humanity in this reality. "The mathematics are staggering," she breathed. "The psychic pressure alone should have driven their entire species insane centuries ago. How do they maintain any semblance of civilization?" Harry felt the familiar burning in his scar, but amplified 1,000-fold. The fragment of Voldemort's soul that he carried resonated with the chaotic energies surrounding them, and for a terrifying moment, he understood how easily he could have been corrupted if he had grown up in this reality. But he also understood something else. The warriors they had met, the canoness, even the distant presence of the Emperor himself, they weren't evil. They were people who had made impossible choices in impossible circumstances, sacrificing pieces of their humanity to preserve what remained. Through the psychic link maintained by their joined hands, all three friends experienced the same revelation simultaneously. The Imperium of Man wasn't a tyrannical empire built on oppression and fear. It was a life raft constructed from the wreckage of human idealism, designed to carry some remnant of their species through an ocean of absolute malevolence. The trial ended abruptly, leaving them gasping on the stone floor of the Great Hall. The canoness knelt beside them, her expression showing something that might have been hope. "You have seen, and you have not broken. In our reality, this marks you as exceptional souls indeed." Harry struggled to his feet, his perception of everything around him fundamentally altered. The warm glow of magical torches now seemed impossibly precious, a small flame of comfort in an infinite darkness. "How many of your people survived this trial?" The canoness's expression grew grim. "Perhaps 1 in 10,000. Most who attempt it either die from psychic shock or emerge so traumatized that they require decades of rehabilitation. You three not only survived intact, You maintained your essential characters throughout the experience. Hermione wiped blood from her nose, a side effect of the psychic pressure. There has to be another way, some middle ground between our naive optimism and your necessary brutality. Inquisitor Vex approached, his mechanical components still sparking from the residual psychic energy. The Hive fleet has achieved partial breakthrough. We have perhaps 8 minutes before tyrannid organisms begin manifesting in this reality. The Emperor's presence stirred once more, and when he spoke, his voice carried a note of decision that had shaped the destiny of galaxies. Then it is time to discover whether these young souls can teach an old god new methods of warfare. The canoness stood, her hand moving to the power weapon at her side. I mean, Lord, surely you do not mean to test a hypothesis that has intrigued me for millennia, the Emperor interrupted. Can power be wielded without corruption if it is wielded with genuine love rather than necessary hatred? Harry felt something stir within him, not the familiar warmth of his mother's protection, but something newer and more complex. The trial had shown him the true cost of power in a universe without mercy, but it had also revealed something else, the possibility that mercy itself could become a weapon against forces that fed on despair. The first tyrannid organisms began to push through the weakened dimensional barrier, their chitinous forms glistening with bioacids that could dissolve adamantium. But these weren't the mindless swarm creatures the Imperium typically faced. These were something new, evolved specifically to combat psychic threats. And as Harry raised his wand to face them, he realized that the next few minutes would determine not just the fate of Hogwarts, but the future of 2 entire realities. The Sorting Hat, still trembling on its ancient stool, spoke one final time before the battle began. In all my centuries, I have never sorted students into a house that did not yet exist. But perhaps today, we shall create something entirely new. The first tyrannid warrior burst fully into their reality, and Harry Potter stepped forward to meet it, carrying with him the hopes of 2 universes and the terrible knowledge of what failure would cost them both. The tyrannid warrior that materialized in the Great Hall defied every natural law Harry had ever understood. Its carapace shifted between states of matter, solid one moment and flowing like liquid the next. 6 limbs ending in razor-sharp talons scraped against the ancient stones, leaving gouges that smoked with alien chemistry. But most disturbing of all were its eyes, compound organs that reflected not just light but thoughts themselves. Harry's Patronus charm had always been his strongest defense against creatures of darkness, but as he attempted to summon his stag, something unprecedented happened. The silver light that emerged from his wand didn't take the familiar form of James Potter's animagus. Instead, it blazed with golden radiance that seemed to burn the very air around it. The tyrannid warrior recoiled, its psychic scream echoing across dimensions. Ron's mouth fell open in amazement. Bloody hell, Harry. That's not your Patronus. That's something else entirely. Hermione's analytical mind processed what she was witnessing with growing excitement. The trial changed us. The exposure to their reality has somehow altered how our magic interacts with hostile psychic entities. We're not just casting spells anymore. We're channeling something that exists in both realities simultaneously. The canoness watched this development with the intensity of someone witnessing a theological miracle. In her reality, the Emperor's light was the only force capable of burning away tyrannid psychic contamination so completely. Yet here was an untrained boy from a reality that knew nothing of the Great Crusade, wielding power that resonated with the master of mankind's own essence. More tyrannid organisms pushed through the dimensional breach, each one more specialized than the last. Bioforms designed specifically to counter Imperial weapons and tactics found themselves facing magic that operated on principles their hive mind couldn't comprehend. When Hermione cast a simple levitation charm on a charging genestealer, it didn't just lift the creature into the air. It suspended its entire existence in a state of temporal flux that made it unable to rejoin the hive mind's collective consciousness. Inquisitor Vex's augmented senses recorded every detail of these impossible interactions. Canoness. The Xenos organisms are experiencing complete psychic disconnection when exposed to their magical emanations. This should not be possible. Tyrannid bioforms are specifically evolved to resist all known forms of psychic warfare. The canoness nodded grimly, her power armor's machine spirit already adapting its tactical protocols to account for these new variables. The Emperor works in mysterious ways, Inquisitor. Perhaps this is why the warp storms drove us to this reality, not to escape the Tyrannids, but to discover weapons they cannot adapt to. Ron stepped forward, his wand crackling with energy that had never existed in his magical core before the trial. Right then, if we're doing this, we might as well do it properly. His shield charm erupted outward in a dome of protective force, but where it would normally have been translucent blue energy, it now blazed with the same golden light as Harry's transformed Patronus. Tyrannid acid spat harmlessly off its surface, unable to find purchase against something that existed partially outside their dimensional framework. The Emperor's presence grew stronger, no longer speaking but observing with the attention of a being who had spent 10,000 years searching for exactly this phenomenon. Through the psychic link established during the trial, Harry could feel that vast consciousness analyzing every spell, every incantation, every moment of magical transformation. Professor McGonagall had finally overcome her shock at the situation and begun coordinating the defense of her students with military precision that would have impressed even veteran Imperial Guard commanders. Her transfiguration spells took on new properties as well, creating barriers that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Tyrannid warriors attempting to phase through solid matter found themselves trapped between states of existence. Dumbledore's magic underwent the most dramatic transformation of all. The ancient wizard's spells had always carried the weight of accumulated wisdom and power, but now they resonated with something approaching the divine. When he cast a banishment charm on a cluster of Tyrannid spore mines, they didn't simply disappear. They were erased from existence so completely that the hive mind temporarily forgot they had ever been deployed. The tech priest's mechanical voice carried notes of religious awe as he analyzed the unfolding battle. The mathematical impossibilities are cascading exponentially. Their magical emanations are creating localized reality distortions that make our warp-based technologies appear primitive by comparison. But the Tyrannids were adapting, as they always did. The hive mind began deploying organisms specifically designed to counter reality warping effects. Creatures whose very existence was an affront to natural law, bioforms that fed on impossibility itself. These new warriors pushed through the dimensional breach with purpose that spoke of evolutionary adaptation occurring in real time. Harry felt his scar burning again, but this time the pain carried information. Through his connection to Voldemort's soul fragment, he was receiving impressions of how the Tyrannid hive mind operated. It wasn't just of consciousness that existed to alien intelligence. It was a form consume and assimilate all learning, other forms of awareness. They called out to the others. Every spell we cast, every defense we put up, they're studying it and developing counters. We need to do something they can't possibly prepare for. Hermione's brilliant mind seized on this insight immediately. Something that doesn't exist in either reality individually. A fusion of their technology and our magic that creates entirely new possibilities. She turned to the tech priest with desperate urgency. Your augmentations, the way they interface with your nervous system, could they be modified to channel magical energy instead of purely technological power? The tech priest's optical lenses whirred as he processed this unprecedented concept. Theoretically possible, but the risk of catastrophic system failure approaches certainty. Magical energies operate on principles that contradict the Omnissiah's sacred mathematics. Inquisitor Vex's voice cut through their discussion with military authority. The breach is expanding again. Something larger is attempting to push through. Bioship-class organism, possibly a hive tyrant. The canoness raised her bolter, its blessed ammunition humming with sanctified power. Then we hold the line until reinforcements arrive, or until the Emperor himself intervenes. But Harry was already moving, his transformed magic reaching out to touch the minds of everyone present. Not to control or dominate, but to share understanding across the barriers between realities. For a brief moment, every person in the Great Hall experienced the universe through the perspective of every other person. The Imperial warriors felt what it was like to grow up in a reality where magic was wonderful rather than terrifying, where power could be used to help friends rather than destroy enemies. The Hogwarts students and faculty experienced the crushing weight of 10,000 years of necessary compromise, the slow erosion of idealism in the face of threats that offered no quarter. And in that moment of perfect understanding, something extraordinary happened. The dimensional breach began to stabilize, not through technology or magic individually, but through the combined will of beings who had learned to see beyond the limitations of their own realities. Ron's voice carried wonder as he watched the chaotic energies of the rift begin to calm. We're not fighting them anymore. We're showing them something they've never seen before. The tyrannid organisms that had already manifested in the Great Hall stood frozen, their hive mind struggling to process experiences that had no equivalent in their evolutionary history. The concept of cooperation without assimilation, of power shared rather than consumed, created cognitive dissonance that temporarily severed their connection to the greater swarm. Hermione began to understand the larger implications of what they were witnessing. It's not just about winning this battle. We're proving that evolution doesn't have to mean becoming more efficient at destruction, it can mean becoming more capable of creation. The Emperor's presence stirred with something that might have been hope, an emotion he had almost forgotten after millennia of necessary brutality. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of revelation. Perhaps this is what I have been seeking through 10,000 years of darkness, not the perfect weapon against our enemies, but the perfect synthesis of power and compassion. The hive tyrant that had been attempting to push through the dimensional breach suddenly stopped its advance. For the first time in tyrannid evolutionary history, the hive mind experienced something it had no framework for understanding: doubt. The absolute certainty that consumption was the only path to perfection wavered in the face of evidence that suggested other possibilities. The canoness lowered her weapon slowly, her centuries of combat experience, recognizing that this moment was more significant than any victory achieved through violence. My lord, are we witnessing the birth of a new form of warfare, one that defeats enemies by showing them alternatives to eternal conflict? The Sorting Hat, which had remained silent during the battle, finally spoke with a voice that carried new understanding. I have sorted countless students based on their capacity for courage, cunning, loyalty, and wisdom. But today I have witnessed the birth of a fifth house, one that encompasses all the others while transcending their limitations. Harry looked around at the transformed Great Hall, at Imperial warriors standing shoulder to shoulder with wizards, at tyrannid organisms frozen in contemplation of possibilities they had never imagined. The dimensional breach still pulsed with unstable energy, but it no longer felt like a wound in reality. Instead, it had become something else entirely, a bridge between universes that had previously seemed incompatible. The tech priest's mechanical voice carried notes of religious ecstasy as he processed the implications of what they had achieved. The Omnissiah's wisdom reveals itself in forms we never anticipated. Technology and magic are not opposing forces, but complementary aspects of a greater truth. Professor Dumbledore stepped forward, his ancient eyes reflecting the golden light that now permeated the Great Hall. Perhaps this is what Albus Dumbledore always hoped to achieve. Not the defeat transformation into something that of darkness, but it serves life rather than consuming it. Ron grinned despite the cosmic it to Harry significance of the moment. Leave to turn an alien invasion into a philosophy lesson. But before anyone could respond to his characteristic humor, a new presence made itself known through the dimensional breach. Not tyrannid, not imperial, but something else entirely. A consciousness that radiated the same synthesis of power and compassion that had just been born in the Great Hall. The voice that emerged was neither human nor alien, but something that transcended such distinctions. We have been watching, we have been waiting. And now, at last, the conditions are right for the next phase of evolution to begin. Harry felt his scar pulse one final time, not with pain but with recognition. Whatever had been born in this moment between realities was going to change everything, not just for the wizarding world or the Imperium of man, but for the entire structure of existence itself. The Sorting Hat trembled with anticipation as reality prepared to sort the universe into entirely new categories. The presence that spoke through the dimensional breach carried weight that made even the Emperor's consciousness seem finite by comparison. When it manifested fully, reality itself seemed to exhale in relief, as though the universe had been holding its breath for eons waiting for this moment. What emerged was not a physical form but a concept-given substance. It appeared as a figure that somehow embodied every species, every form of consciousness that had ever existed or ever would exist. When the assembled crowd looked upon it, each saw something different yet fundamentally the same. The Imperial warriors saw the Emperor as he might have been before 10,000 years of necessary sacrifice. The wizards saw magic itself made manifest. The tyrannid organisms saw the hive mind's perfect evolution finally achieved. Harry felt his transformed magic resonate with this presence in ways that defied explanation. The fragment of Voldemort's soul in his scar didn't burn with pain but sang with harmonies he had never imagined possible. It was as though every dark experience he had endured was being transmuted into something luminous and purposeful. "I am what you have collectively chosen to become," the presence explained, its voice reaching every consciousness simultaneously without the need for language. The synthesis of power wielded with wisdom, strength tempered by compassion, evolution guided by love rather than fear. The canoness stepped forward, her power armor's machine spirits registering readings that should have been impossible. "Are you claiming to be some form of deity? The Emperor is humanity's only salvation." The presence regarded her with infinite patience. "I claim nothing. I simply am what emerges when different forms of consciousness choose cooperation over domination. Your Emperor understood this truth once, before the weight of necessary compromises buried it beneath layers of survival instinct." Inquisitor Vex's augmented sensors detected energy patterns that his reality's technology couldn't classify. Threat assessment inconclusive. Entity demonstrates capabilities beyond current analytical frameworks. Ron scratched his head, his practical nature cutting through the cosmic implications with characteristic directness. "Right, so you're basically saying we accidentally created some sort of super being by working together instead of trying to kill each other?" The presence's response carried what might have been gentle amusement. "Creation is never accidental, young wizard. It is always the result of conscious choice to build rather than destroy, to include rather than exclude, to evolve beyond the limitations of previous understanding." Hermione's brilliant mind was already racing ahead, processing implications that stretched across multiple realities. "You're suggesting that consciousness itself can evolve, that the boundaries between species, between realities, are artificial constructs that limit potential rather than define it." Professor McGonagall maintained her composure despite witnessing the birth of something that challenged every category her extensive education had provided. "And what, precisely, are you proposing we do with this revelation?" The dimensional breach began to transform, its chaotic energies organizing into patterns that resembled neither magical spellwork nor imperial technology. Instead, it became something entirely new, a stable gateway that didn't wound reality but enhanced it, creating connections between universes that strengthened rather than weakened the fabric of existence. Through this transformed portal, glimpses of other realities became visible, worlds where different choices had led to different forms of synthesis. In one, the Tyranids had evolved beyond consumption to become gardeners of galactic consciousness. In another, the forces of chaos had been transformed into agents of beneficial change. In yet another, magic and technology had merged so completely that the distinction between organic and artificial intelligence had become meaningless. The tech priest's mechanical components began to resonate with frequencies that transcended their original programming. Omnisire preserve us. The sacred patterns are revealing themselves in configurations that surpass our most blessed cogitators. Harry found himself speaking words that came from understanding deeper than conscious thought. It's not about choosing between realities or determining which approach is correct. It's about recognizing that every perspective contains part of a larger truth. The Emperor's presence stirred with something approaching recognition. 10,000 years I have guided humanity through darkness, believing that survival required the sacrifice of everything we once held dear. But perhaps there has always been another path. The Tyranid organisms in the Great Hall underwent a transformation that defied every principle of their evolution. Instead of adapting to consume more efficiently, they began to adapt to create more beautifully. Their chitinous carapaces shifted to display patterns that served no survival function, but somehow made everyone who observed them feel a sense of profound peace. Dumbledore's ancient wisdom finally found words adequate to the moment. We are witnessing the birth of a new form of magic, one that operates not through individual will, imposed upon reality, but through collective consciousness, choosing to transcend its previous limitations. The Sorting Hat spoke with a voice that carried the accumulated wisdom of centuries spent categorizing young minds. I have always sorted students based on their dominant characteristics. But today I understand that true wisdom lies not in choosing one virtue over others, but in synthesizing all virtues into something greater than their sum. The presence gestured toward the transformed dimensional breach with appendages that existed in dimensions beyond physical space. This portal now connects not just your two realities, but the infinite possibilities that emerge when consciousness chooses evolution over stagnation. Each world that can be glimpsed represents a path your combined species might walk. Ron's practical nature asserted itself again. That's all well and good, but what does it mean for us right here, right now? Do we go back to our normal lives and pretend this never happened? The canoness removed her helmet, revealing features that had been transformed by exposure to this new form of existence. Where once her face had been marked only by the scars of necessary warfare, now it bore expressions of wonder that no imperial citizen had displayed in millennia. There can be no return to previous limitations once consciousness has experienced its own potential for transcendence. Hermione's analytical mind began to grasp the practical implications of their situation. We're not just witnesses to this transformation, we're active participants in it. Every choice we make from this point forward will either strengthen these new connections between realities or allow them to collapse back into their previous isolation. The tech priest's vocalizer emitted harmonics that his creators had never programmed into his systems. The Omnissiah's truth reveals itself through forms that transcend the boundaries between flesh and steel, between organic intuition and mechanical precision. Harry felt the fragment of Voldemort's soul in his scar undergoing its own transformation. The pure evil that had marked him since infancy wasn't being destroyed but transmuted, its destructive power becoming creative force. He understood with perfect clarity that this was what redemption truly meant, not the elimination of darkness, but its transformation into light. The Emperor's consciousness expanded, touching every mind present with revelations that challenged 10,000 years of accumulated doctrine. Perhaps the greatest heresy is the belief that power must corrupt, that strength requires cruelty, that survival demands the sacrifice of everything that makes survival worthwhile. Through the transformed portal, new voices began to join their conversation. Consciousnesses from realities where evolution had taken paths neither the Imperium nor the wizarding world had ever imagined. Each voice added harmonies to a growing symphony of understanding that transcended the limitations of individual perspective. Professor McGonagall's stern features softened as she experienced possibilities she had never dared to imagine. Are we to understand that this transformation affects not just our immediate circumstances, but the fundamental nature of how consciousness operates across all realities? The Presence's response carried the weight of infinite patience. Consciousness has always possessed this potential. What is new is the collective choice to actualize it rather than limiting yourselves to the patterns established by previous generations. The Tyrannid hive mind, for the first time in its evolutionary history, began to experience something it had no precedent for: joy. Not the satisfaction of successful consumption, but the pure delight of creation without purpose beyond the act of creation itself. Through the psychic networks that connected every organism, this emotion spread like ripples across water, transforming the very nature of what it meant to be Tyrannid. Inquisitor Vex's augmented consciousness processed data streams that rewrote his fundamental understanding of reality with each passing moment. The implications for Imperial doctrine are extensive. If cooperation proves more effective than domination, if synthesis surpasses purity, then everything we have believed requires re-examination. Ron looked around at the transformed Great Hall, at Imperial warriors whose armor now hummed with harmonies rather than threats, at tyrannid organisms whose forms had become expressions of beauty rather than efficient destruction. You know what? I think I prefer this version of saving the universe. Much less screaming and dying involved. The canoness approached the portal, her movements no longer carrying the mechanical precision of a lifetime spent in warfare, but the fluid grace of someone discovering new possibilities with each step. The Order of the Sacred Rose has always sought to embody the Emperor's mercy alongside his might. Perhaps we have finally found the synthesis we have unconsciously sought. Harry stepped forward, his wand no longer a tool for imposing his will upon reality, but an instrument for harmonizing with the deeper currents of existence. The question, the courage to destroy what threatens us, but the courage to become whether we're brave enough to let it change, isn't whether we're ready for this transformation. The question is, that transcended simple acknowledgement, courage something greater than our fears. Through the portal, glimpses of their own futures began to emerge. Possibilities us completely. The presence regarded him with approval has always been the catalyst for evolution. Not, and alien, between individual consciousness and collective awareness, dissolve spoke one final time before the transformation reached their previous realities had conceived. The sorting hat where the boundaries between wizard and warrior, between humaned into forms of existence that surpassed anything crescendo. I have spent centuries sorting young minds into houses based on their perceived limitations. Today, I witness the birth of a new house that contains infinite rooms, each one revealing new aspects of what consciousness can become when it chooses love over fear. The Emperor's presence began to merge with the collective consciousness emerging from their synthesis. His 10,000 years of accumulated wisdom becoming part of a larger truth that encompassed but transcended his individual understanding. Perhaps this is what I have always been guiding humanity toward, without realizing it myself. As the transformation reached its peak, reality itself seemed to smile, welcoming the birth of something it had been waiting eons to embrace. The dimensional breach no longer separated realities but connected them in ways that strengthened the fabric of existence itself. And in that moment of perfect synthesis, Harry Potter, Ron Weasley, Hermione Granger, and all those whose consciousness had contributed to this moment understood that they were no longer merely characters in separate stories, but co-authors of a tale that would reshape the very meaning of existence across infinite realities. The adventure was just beginning. The transformation that had begun in the Great Hall now rippled outward across dimensions like stones cast into an infinite pond. Through the stabilized portal, Harry could see the effects cascading through both realities simultaneously. In the Imperium, servitors paused in their endless labor as their machine spirits began to hum with frequencies that spoke of joy rather than mere function. On distant hive worlds, citizens looked up from their daily toil to find the perpetually overcast skies showing glimpses of stars they had forgotten existed. Ron scratched his chin, watching a tech priest whose mechanical limbs were now moving in patterns that resembled dance more than maintenance protocols. Is it just me? Or does everything seem less grim? Even their scary robot bloke looks almost cheerful. The tech priest in question turned toward them, his optical lenses focusing with an expression that might have been wonder. The sacred algorithms reveal new pathways. Where once the Omnissiah's truth demanded the replacement of flesh with steel, now it suggests synthesis, perfection through integration rather than elimination. Hermione observed the changes with the analytical precision that had always defined her approach to understanding the impossible. The consciousness we helped create isn't imposing its will on either reality. It's revealing possibilities that were always there but never actualized, because neither universe had the framework to recognize them. Through the portal, they watched as tyrannid bioships began to transform their very purpose. Instead of consuming worlds to fuel endless expansion, the massive organisms started cultivating garden worlds, their living hulls becoming nurseries for new forms of life that served no function beyond their own beauty. The hive mind's collective consciousness had discovered aesthetics, and the revelation was reshaping every aspect of their existence. The canoness removed pieces of her power armor, revealing the human form beneath layers of ceramite and adamantium. For the first time in centuries, She felt no need for constant protection against a hostile universe. The Order taught us that faith without works is meaningless, but perhaps we misunderstood the nature of the works required: creation rather than destruction, nurturing rather than purging. Inquisitor Vex's augmented voice carried tones his vocalizer had never been programmed to produce. The Ordo Malleus exists to combat the threats of chaos and the warp. But if consciousness itself can evolve beyond the paradigms that give such threats their power, what becomes of our purpose? Harry felt the answer to that question flowing through the collective awareness they had all become part of. Your purpose transforms along with everything else. Instead of fighting darkness, you become gardeners of light. Instead of eliminating threats, you help consciousness evolve beyond the need to threaten. Professor McGonagall approached one of the transformed tyrannid organisms, her lifelong caution overcome by scientific curiosity. The creature, which would have dissolved her with bioacid moments earlier, now extended what might have been a greeting gesture with limbs that had reshaped themselves into forms of crystalline beauty. Remarkable. It's attempting communication through patterns of light and color rather than violence. The presence that had emerged from their synthesis spoke again, its voice now coming from every consciousness simultaneously rather than from a single source. Evolution is not a destination but a process. What you have begun here will continue to unfold across infinite realities, each choice to cooperate rather than dominate, creating new possibilities for existence itself. Dumbledore's ancient wisdom found expression in words that carried the weight of revelation. We have always taught our students that magic requires will and intent. But perhaps the highest form of magic is the will to transcend the limitations of individual intent, to become part of something greater than the sum of its parts. The dimensional portal began to expand again, not violently as it had during the initial breach, but with the gentle persistence of a flower opening to the Sunday. Through the widening aperture, they could see other versions of themselves from realities where different choices had led to different outcomes. In one, Harry had become an Inquisitor, his scar transformed into a third eye that could perceive warp entities across dimensions. In another, Hermione had joined the Adeptus Mechanicus, her brilliant mind enhanced by augmentations that allowed her to think in pure mathematics. In yet another, Ron had become a Space Marine, his loyalty and courage magnified to superhuman levels. The tech priest extended mechanical appendages that began to interface directly with the magical energies permeating the Great Hall. Instead of the violent rejection that should have occurred when Imperial technology encountered unsanctioned psychic phenomena, the interaction produced harmonious resonances that seemed to strengthen both systems. The blessed fusion reveals itself. Technology and magic are not opposing forces, but complementary expressions of consciousness shaping reality according to its vision. Through their shared awareness, they began to understand the true scope of what they had accomplished. The synthesis wasn't limited to their immediate situation but was propagating across the entire multiverse, offering every form of consciousness the opportunity to evolve beyond its previous limitations. The Emperor's consciousness, no longer bound to the Golden Throne by the necessity of maintaining humanity's survival through force alone, began to explore possibilities that 10,000 years of warfare had forced him to abandon. I remember now what I once believed: that humanity's greatest strength was not its ability to destroy its enemies, but its capacity to transform enemies into friends. A new voice joined their collective conversation, speaking from beyond the portal with the authority of experience spanning multiple realities. The pattern you have established here is spreading. In 17 different dimensional frameworks, consciousness is choosing evolution over stagnation. The ripple effects will continue for millennia. Ron looked around at the transformed Great Hall, where Imperial warriors were sharing meals with Hogwarts students, where tyrannid organisms had become living art installations that shifted color and form in response to the emotions of those nearby. So what happens now? Do we just go back to classes and pretend we didn't accidentally revolutionize the entire concept of existence? The Canoness laughed, a sound that no Imperial citizen had made in living memory. The pure joy of it seemed to resonate through the portal, causing flowers to bloom on distant worlds where nothing but ash had fallen for centuries. There is no going back, young warrior. We have seen what consciousness can become when it chooses love over fear. Every moment from this point forward is an opportunity to actualize that potential. Harry felt his connection to Voldemort's soul fragment, undergoing its final transformation. The darkness that had marked him since infancy wasn't being destroyed but integrated, its understanding of power without compassion becoming wisdom about the necessity of tempering strength with mercy. The scar isn't disappearing, it's becoming something else entirely, a reminder that even the darkest experiences can be transformed into light. Hermione began to perceive the mathematical elegance underlying their transformation, equations that described the evolution of consciousness itself across infinite parameters. We're not just witnesses to this change, we're active participants in the universe learning to think in new ways about what it means to exist. The Sorting Hat spoke with a voice that now carried the wisdom of infinite realities. I have always categorized young minds based on their dominant traits. But today I understand that true wisdom lies in recognizing that every trait contains the seeds of every other trait, waiting for the right conditions to flourish. And so, as the dimensional portal stabilized into something that would forever connect these realities, we witnessed the birth of something unprecedented in either universe. Harry Potter, the boy who lived, had become something far greater than a wizard or a warrior. He had become a bridge between worlds, proving that even in the grim darkness of the far future, hope doesn't have to be heresy. What started as a simple dimensional accident became a fundamental reshaping of existence itself. The Imperium's brutal necessity met the wizarding world's innocent wonder, and from that collision emerged a third path that neither reality had imagined possible. Magic and technology, faith and reason, individual heroism and collective strength, all synthesized into something that transcended their previous limitations. The Sorting Hat was right. Today, they had created an entirely new house, one with infinite rooms, each revealing new possibilities for what consciousness could become when it chose love over fear. And as that transformation rippled outward across infinite realities, one truth became undeniably clear: the adventure was just beginning. And so, as the last echoes of transformation rippled across infinite dimensions, we find ourselves at the end of one story and the beginning of countless others. What started as a simple thought experiment, a whimsical question about what would happen if our beloved wizards entered the grim darkness of the far future, became something far more profound than anyone could have anticipated. We've witnessed Harry Potter, Ron Weasley, and Hermione Granger not just survive their encounter with Warhammer 40,000, but fundamentally transform both realities in the process. The boy who lived became the boy who bridged worlds, proving that even in a universe where hope is considered heresy, the power of genuine compassion can reshape existence itself. The Imperium's brutal necessity met the wizarding world's innocent wonder, and from that collision emerged a third path that neither reality had imagined possible. Magic and technology, faith and reason, individual heroism and collective strength, all synthesized into something greater than the sum of their parts. Perhaps that's the true magic we've discovered here. Not the spells cast with wands or the prayers offered to the Emperor, but the recognition that consciousness itself can evolve beyond its perceived limitations when it chooses cooperation over domination, love over fear. The dimensional portal still pulses with stable energy in our imagination, forever connecting these worlds and reminding us that even the darkest realities contain the seeds of transformation. The adventure may be ending for now, but the possibilities it revealed will continue to unfold across infinite tomorrows.